Today, I want to talk to you about a topic that for me really helps you develop as a photographer and kind of take a big leap forward. And that's being able to look at any photograph and dissect the lighting in that image. Now, what does that mean? It means that you're going to be able to look at an image in a magazine, an advertisement, maybe on Instagram, and quickly pick it apart to figure out how many lights there are, what kind of lighting modifiers were used, where those lights were positioned, and really you're going to be able to recreate almost any image you see. So why don't we dive into it, and I'm going to take you through kind of the clues and things to look for to pick apart each aspect of the lighting in an image. Then we're going to look at some images and kind of pick apart the lighting ourselves and sort of put that into practice. If you have any questions throughout this whole process, please just drop them down in the comments below. I'm happy to dive in and answer them, and we can have a bit more of a dialogue that way. But let's take a look at what are the things to look at when you're trying to reverse engineer the lighting in a photograph. I think the first step for me is to generally figure out how many lights there are that are being used in the photograph, and also kind of start to figure out what their job is. Now, if you're new to lighting, this might be like, what do you mean what their job is? You just use lights. Their job is to add light. But realistically, most photographers approach lighting in a similar fashion where they have a main light that's providing the bulk of the light and the kind of main directional light. Then they probably have some fill, which is kind of like filling in some of the shadows and allowing you to control the intensity of that shadow. And then they might have a backlight or a kicker light, sometimes called a hair light, that is kind of lighting the subject from the back to accentuate the shape and kind of separate them from the background. Then of course there's background lights, and you can really go out from there. But I think for our purposes, it's really about kind of looking at the light falling on a subject. We're gonna look at portraits here, but also you can do this with product photography just as easily. And the first thing we're gonna look for when figuring out how many lights are being used is the catch lights in the eyes. That's often your first clue. You look deep into the eye and you'll see the reflections of lights usually if they're kind of like hitting the subject from the front. The next clue is counting your shadows and looking at the direction of the shadows. So, if you clearly only see one directional shadow and that's the only shadow that is being cast, then there's likely a single main source of light. However, if you see shadows kind of coming from different directions and crossing each other, or different intensities of shadow in different parts of the face, that probably implies that there's multiple lights. Let's jump in and take a look at some images and apply the lessons from step 1 to them and build our lighting diagram as we go. So the first image we have here is by photographer Jingna Zhang. It's a simple, clean beauty portrait. And if we apply our clues in step 1, which is looking for the catch lights in the eyes first of all. So if you look in the catch lights on the eyes, you can very clearly see there's a single catch light here, a nice big circle, kind of coming from the top right of the image. So I don't see any other catch lights, so it's safe to assume there's one main light hitting her from the front. Similarly, if we look for our second clue, which is the shadows, we can see the shadows are all kind of going in the same direction and have a similar intensity. You can see over here on the left side of her face, underneath the nose, underneath the lips, as well as underneath the chin. They're all have the same kind of tone in the same direction. So everything here points to us to the fact that there's one light being used to light this portrait, and it's just the one main light coming from this direction here. Let's move on to our second portrait. This is by a photographer I really love and been following for a long time. It's a huge inspiration for me, Dan Winters. Now, he has this Obama portrait, which is definitely has a more complicated lighting setup. But again, we're just doing step 1 for now. So let's take a look at the catch lights in the eyes and go from there. So if we zoom in, we see there's actually kind of 2 catch lights here in the eyes. There's a bigger one that we see sort of on the left side and a smaller one on the right. So we know right away there's at least 2 lights in this portrait. Then we can kind of see in the background, there is some light hitting the background, but it's possible that it could be from the same light. So let's just look at the shadows here. We see a very crisp shadow falling kind of right here to the left. You also see a little bit of a shadow on the bottom of the nose here. It's hard to tell if they're the same. But then we also see kind of clearly different levels of brightness. There's like the darkness under his chin here from the shadow. Here it's like a little bit lighter. Here there's a lot of light. Yeah, looking at the image, the shadows do seem to fall kind of from one main direction, but I also get the feeling that because the lighting is so crisp, you know, we're getting some fill light somewhere, and that's sort of why there's two lights there. There's going to be a sort of main hard light casting the majority of the shadows, and then that second light that we're seeing in the eyes is going to be the fill light. So those are the jobs there. Now let's move on to the third sample we're going to be looking throughout this video, and it's by photographer Kwaku Alston. And this is a beautiful portrait for Black Panther, and there's a lot of interesting things going on here. So again, we're going to dive in and look at the catch lights on the eyes. And right away we see there's one tiny kind of catch light on the left and a bigger one on the right. So, you know, this could be a number of things, but obviously we have one big light. If we look at the shadows, we have sort of kind of one specific shadow on the nose here, but then we actually have, you know, some shadows being cast over here and like on this side of the ears. You see there's light coming in. So we're having competing shadows, so that pretty clearly tells us there's one main light here. There's at least another light hitting him from the back. And just the fact that we have this highlight here, you know, it's safe to assume that lighting is not coming from the main light, otherwise his face would be blown out, but that there's probably a third light in there as well. So, you know, we have three, I would say maybe even four lights looking at that, again, small reflection in his eye. Maybe that's like a screen of a computer or something, or maybe that's just a bit of a fill light in there. So once you've started to figure out just how many lights there are in the scene, you can start to pick apart their position and height relative to the subject. And in order to do this, we're going to look at the shadow direction and also the shadow length. If the shadow is very long, for example, if it's falling on my nose, you can see right now there's like a fairly small shadow. You can actually take the tip of the shadow and the tip of the object casting the shadow and sort of draw an invisible line from them. And that gives you an idea of the angle of the light. So, you know, the light I'm looking at is actually, I'm looking at it straight right now, and you can see there's no shadow. And as I move my head down, it starts creating a shadow. So if you look at the shadow direction, it's moving down. That means the light is coming up from above me. And then it's not very long. That means it's not super high above me, but there is some shadow, which means it's sort of coming out from this direction. Now let's apply step 2 to our sample images to find out where the lights are positioned and how high they are. So the first thing we're going to look at, again, is the shadow direction. So we can see here the shadow's kind of coming in down, and if we use our tip of drawing a line from the tip of the shadow to the thing that's casting the shadow, we kind of go straight here across, you know, the light is kind of coming from this direction, which kind of also is revealed by the catch lights in the eyes here, that the light is over here. And then if we look at the length of the shadows, you know, the shadow is actually not very long, which means the light is brought around kind of closer to the front of her face. It's not very much on the side. And we can kind of see, you know, all of this is being lit and even just where the reflection is positioned. So the light is not super high up, it's definitely above eye level, but you know, we're not getting a long shadow on the nose and we're getting it pretty short. So that means it's brought around kind of near the front right of the face looking at the subject. Now let's look at this next image. Where are the lights positioned? Are you starting to get it yet? We're gonna look at the eyes again, and you know, we see the catch light, so we kind of know roughly already there's one light almost directly in front of him and one light to the right, and that's really reinforced by looking at the shadow direction and the shadow length. So if we look at the shadow direction, you know, we can draw a line from this tip of the shadow to his nose, and we know the light is coming kind of above eye level almost. If we look at the shadow around the eyes, there almost is no shadow, which means that it's at the same height. If we now look at, you know, this other light, and we're getting a shadow below here and just some fill light, and I think likely is just right above his head, kind of casting a nice fill. And then we have a more, you know, spotlight on him that's a little harder, more directional, coming in from the right side, just above his eye line. Looking at our final example, you see now as we look at the shadow, it actually is scooping quite a bit lower than the other two images we looked at, which means that light is higher up, and that higher light kind of casts these longer shadows. We see there's a lot more shadow under the eye than we saw in Obama's portrait. Similarly, this angle is moving down, so we can draw a tip kind of from over here at his nose and know that the light, the main light, is coming from up there. And similarly, it is a little bit of a longer shadow, so we know the light's moved around to the side of his face a little bit more than the previous ones. It's still kind of quite straight on, but just off to the side, it's not like fully on the side. Then as we look at these kind of shadows, we can trace a line from this point up to here. So that light's probably coming in quite high. The shadow's kind of going into here, into his beard, and it's just kind of spilling over, and the fact that we're kind of getting some light up here, this light is definitely above the head, but not too far above. As we can see here, it's kind of coming in from this direction. This light, it's a little harder to tell, but again, we know, it's not hitting everything over here, which means it's probably quite high up and focused on this area of the face. That kind of gives us a rough idea of the lights. There's one main light kind of a little hot above his head to the right side, and two behind him for sure, and then maybe a bit of a fill light as well, as we can see in the catch light. So if you know how many lights there are, you know roughly where they're positioned, the final thing to figure out is the lighting modifiers, what kind of modifiers they're using. If you're not familiar with modifiers, there's an infinite number of them, but the big ones you're gonna come across is just like a bare bulb light straight on. It might have a reflector, which is a silver kind of scoop around it. You might get a softbox, which is a bigger box with a scrim or sheet in it that diffuses the light. That softbox might have a grid. You might have an octa, which is an 8-sided, like larger softbox essentially, it's parabolic. Between all those things, those create different types of light. One of the ways to find out what lighting modifiers are being used is to look at the quality of the shadow. So the softer the shadow, that means the bigger the light source is. So it could be a really soft softbox or a big octa, maybe it's just the sky and it's just an overcast day. Whereas the harder the shadow, that means the smaller the light source is. So if you think of a bright sunny day, right? The sun is very small and super far away, so those shadows that are cast are very sharp. Similarly, if you're taking a bare bulb flash and just shooting it at a face, those shadows are going to be very crisp. So that's your first clue, the quality of the shadow and how feathered it is, how long it is, literally just the softness of the shadow. The next thing is specular highlights. Now, we talked about counting lights in terms of looking in the pupils or other reflective surfaces to figure out how many lights there are in the scene. Now, one other clue that you can find when looking at these specular highlights is the shape of the light. So if it's a small light and it's a tiny circle, it's probably just a bare flash, maybe with a small reflector on it. If it's a big square block, maybe it's a window next to the subject or a larger softbox. If it's a big octagonal shape, then it's a big octa, for example. If it's a tiny little donut light right in the center of the eye, well, then you're using a ring light. So just by looking at the pupil and the catch light in the eye, you can learn a lot of information about the lighting setup in the photograph. Jumping back to our images in step 3, we know where the lights are positioned, we know how high they are, we know what their job is. Now we're going to find out what modifiers they're using. So looking at our first image by Jingna Zhang, the shadow is really, really soft. So first we're going to look at the quality of the shadow, and it's just really soft. So it implies we'll probably have some sort of softbox. If we combine what we learned in the quality of the shadow and look at the reflection of the eye, we see it's nice and round. So that actually probably tells us that instead of a softbox, it's actually just a big shoot-through umbrella, which typically causes the sort of like very soft lighting and distinctive circular shape in the specular highlights. Looking over to our next image, we can see compared to the previous one, in this Dan Winters photo, the shadow is really crisp and just that line is super hard. And similarly, if we look at the catch lights, those lights are a lot smaller in size. So right away we know, that's probably a bare bulb flash over there. That first highlight, that's a little smaller. And that's what's really giving this hard directional light. Maybe there's a reflector on it, but it's pretty much just a bare light. This bigger light here, this could be a small softbox actually. It almost has a square look. It's hard to see at this resolution, but typically you would use a small softbox to create some fill, or a larger softbox. And really I think this light in the back, just judging it, maybe there's a light directly hitting that background as well and just kind of snoot it or something. But that's what I would say the lighting modifiers are, like an open hard bulb flash in one light, kind of a small softbox in the fill, and maybe a snooted light or a softbox with a grid on it, which also makes the light more directional to light this background here. Finally, let's jump over to the final image by Kwaku Alston and take a look at the lighting here. You see, this lighting here is on the nose. The shadow is actually a little softer if we compare between the two. You know, the one here is like really hard, whereas this one here is a little bit softer. So what that tells me is it's probably something like a softbox or Octa, because you can still get that kind of harder directional light, but just soften that shadow up a little bit. If we go to look at these ones, you know, the shadows are actually a lot harder than the ones on the nose. So this is probably like a bare light or a light with a reflector on it. Obviously, there's also some sort of filtered gel on it, casting this purple glow. And similarly on the hair and this side of the face, it looks like we actually have a warmer tone. So there's probably like an orangey gel, and this one also, the lighting is very hard, casting a very clean line, and that implies it's probably a hard light. Usually the kind of lights in the background, they're wide open and hard, but they have barn doors, which kind of helps control. So we don't see a ton of this light spilling over. And similarly here, you know, maybe there's a snoot on there or something. So again, there's one main light probably with a softbox or a gridded softbox, then the two background lights kind of lighting the subject from the back are more open, but probably have some sort of like modifiers to control the spill, either a snoot or a grid, or maybe just some barn doors on the light. I hope this technique really helps you grow as a photographer and take your lighting up to the next level. I know for me, the frustration for so long has been how to take that, you know, image that you see in your mind and convert it into reality. And often there's just like a block where you just can't get past it and get that final level. And while it might not be as sexy as, you know, the latest camera or lens or desk setup, I think techniques like this are the ones that really take your photography up to the next level and give you that control to make your ideas into reality. So I hope it helps you do that. If you're new here, I'd love for you to introduce yourself down in the comments below. My name is Eugene from Worker Bee Supply, and that's a wrap.